The rain in Seattle wasn't just rain. It was a relentless, hammering curtain of water that turned the asphalt of Highway 101 into a black mirror, reflecting the chaotic lights of the city fading in the rearview mirror. Inside the cabin of a silver McLaren worth more than most houses in the state, Stephen Thomas gripped the leather steering wheel with knuckles that were white from tension, though not from fear. At 36 years old, Stephen had never really known fear. He dealt in acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and software mergers. He was the CEO of Thomas Dynamics, a man who saw people as variables in an equation he was destined to solve. Tonight, however, the equation was failing. A notification on his dashboard screen blinked incessantly: a failed merger, a betrayal by a board member he had trusted. His mind was miles away, dissecting the legal ramifications, calculating the fallout, completely ignoring the hydroplaning tires beneath him. He was a man who believed he could control everything, even the laws of physics. Miles away in the small, struggling township of Oak Creek, Laura Perez was finishing a double shift at the Rusty Spoon, a diner that smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and grease. Laura was 28, but the dark circles under her amber eyes made her look older. She wiped down the counter with a practiced, weary motion, her mind tallying the tips in her apron pocket. $42. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. Between the rent for the dilapidated trailer she shared with her younger brother, Ryan Robinson, and the payments on the loan she had taken out for her late mother's hospice care, Laura was drowning. But Laura had a second life. Juanda didn't pay a dime, but gave her the only sense of purpose she had left. She was a volunteer firefighter for the county. Her radio, clipped to her belt, was silent for now, but she kept a hand near it, almost like a talisman. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a savior in waiting, a woman who ran toward the heat when everyone else ran away. Stephen pushed the car faster. The speedometer climbed past 90. The anger in his chest was a hot coal, burning brighter with every mile. He didn't see the patch of oil slicked over the wet curve until it was too late. The McLaren lost traction. It was a terrifyingly silent moment, the loss of control, before the world turned into a violent kaleidoscope of shattering glass and twisting metal. The car spun, clipped the guardrail, and launched off the embankment, tumbling down into the ravine below. It crashed through the tree line, rolling 3 times before landing upside down in a shallow, rocky creek bed. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hiss of steam rising from the crushed engine and the ominous crackle of a fire starting near the fuel tank. Laura was driving her beat-up Ford truck home when the call came over the radio. Vehicle off the road, Mili Marker 42, smoke visible. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was the closest unit. She didn't hesitate. Flipping on her dash light, she spun the truck around, tires screeching on the wet pavement. When she arrived at the edge of the ravine, she could already see the orange glow reflecting off the wet pine trees below. The fire was growing. She grabbed her gear bag, slid down the muddy embankment, disregarding the brambles tearing at her uniform. When she reached the wreckage, the heat was intense. The driver was unconscious, hanging from his seatbelt, blood streaming from a deep gash on his forehead. It was Ski. He looked nothing like the titan of industry now. He looked broken, mortal. Laura assessed the situation instantly. The fuel line was ruptured. "Hey!" she shouted, smashing the passenger window with her rescue tool. No response. She crawled inside the overturned cabin, the smell of gasoline overwhelming. She cut the seatbelt, bracing his weight as he slumped. He was heavy, dead weight, but adrenaline gave Laura a strength she didn't know she possessed. She dragged him out through the shattered window, pulling him across the mud just as the gas tank ignited. The explosion threw them both forward, a wave of heat searing the back of Laura's neck. She shielded his body with hers, taking the brunt of the falling debris. At the county hospital, chaos reigned. Stephen was rushed into trauma. Laura, covered in mud, soot, and Stephen's blood, stood in the hallway, breathing hard. She watched them cut away his expensive suit. A nurse shouted, "We need blood. He's hemorrhaging. Typo negative. Stat." Laura stepped forward, her voice raspy from smoke inhalation. She didn't wait for permission. She sat in the donor chair, rolling up her sleeve. She gave a pint, then refused to leave until she knew he was stable. She watched from the shadows as the doctors worked, feeling a strange, inexplicable tether to the man whose life she had just snatched from the fire. Entered Deborah Harris, the hospital's chief administrator, a woman whose ambition was as sharp as her surgical enhancements. She recognized Stephen Thomas immediately. This wasn't just a patient. This was a golden ticket. Deborah had a daughter, Jessica Sanchez, 23, a chaotic, aspiring influencer who is currently drowning in credit card debt and scandal. Deborah saw the opportunity of a lifetime. She found Jessica in the cafeteria, scrolling on her phone. "Listen to me," Deborah hissed, gripping her daughter's arm. "The man in trauma 1 is Stephen Thomas. He's going to wake up confused. He won't remember who pulled him out. You did. Do you understand?" Laura, exhausted and dizzy from the blood donation and the adrenaline crash, was sitting in the waiting room when Deborah approached her. "We don't need you here anymore," Deborah said coldly, her eyes scanning Laura's dirty uniform with disdain. "The family is on the way. You're clogging up the hallway." Laura, too tired to fight, and assuming the family was actually present, nodded. She left without a name, without a thank you, just a ghost in the rain. 3 days later, Shivan woke up. His vision was blurry, his body a map of pain. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. A figure moved beside his bed. It wasn't the strong, soot-covered woman who had shielded him from the fire. It was Jessica, wearing a pristine white dress, looking at him with practiced concern. "You're awake," she cooed, holding a glass of water to his lips. "I was so worried." Stephen squinted, his memory a fractured haze of fire and rain. He remembered a presence, a strength, a scent of rain and smoke. He looked at Jessica's manicured hands, devoid of a single scratch. Something felt off. A dissonant note in a melody, but the drugs and the pain drowned it out. Deborah stepped in, wearing her white coat like armor. "Mr. Thomas, you're very lucky. My daughter, Jessica, happened to be driving by. She saved your life." Stephen looked at Jessica again. "You?" he rasped. Jessica squeezed his hand, a tear summoned with great effort rolling down her cheek. "I couldn't leave you there, Stephen. I just felt..." Stephen, a man who had never been given anything without a price tag attached, felt a surge of overwhelming gratitude. He had been alone his whole life, surrounded by sharks. Now, he believed he had found an angel. 6 months passed. The narrative had been cemented. Stephen Thomas and his savior, Jessica Sanchez, were the city-esque golden couple. Stephen had showered Jessica with gifts of penthouse, a new convertible to replace the one she supposedly drove that night, and an allowance that could fund a small country. But Stephen wasn't happy. He was recovering, his leg healing from the fractures, but he felt a hollowness he couldn't explain. Jessica was demanding. She had no interest in his work, his thoughts, or his quiet moments. She only cared about the galas, the press, and the credit. Meanwhile, Laura's life had crumbled. The burns on her back from the explosion had required treatment she couldn't afford, forcing her to miss shifts at the diner. She was let go. The bank was threatening foreclosure on the trailer. Desperate, she took a job through a temp agency as part of the cleaning staff at the new Thomas Dynamics headquarters downtown. It was a humiliating twist of fate cleaning the floors of the man she had saved while he walked past her, unseeing, on the arm of a woman who had never held a hose in her life. One afternoon, Stephen was in his office, frustrated with Jessica's incessant texting about a jewelry auction. He threw his phone down and walked to the window, looking out at the city. Neither there. He decided to go down to the lobby garden, a private sanctuary he had built for employees but rarely used. He sat on a bench, rubbing his aching leg. Laura was there, tending to a spilled coffee on the stone pathway. She didn't see him at first. She was humming a soft melody, the same tune she had hummed to herself in the ambulance to stay calm after the rescue. Stephen froze. The sound hit him like a physical blow. It cut through the fog of his memory. He turned, seeing a woman in a gray janitorial jumpsuit, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked tired, thin, but her hands. He watched her hands wring out the cloth. They were strong hands, rough hands. "Excuse me," Stephen said, his voice startling her. Laura jumped, dropping the cloth. She looked up, and for the first time since the accident, their eyes met. Amber eyes. Stephen felt a jolt of recognition that terrified him. He asked, stepping closer. Laura's heart raced. She recognized him instantly, of course. He looked better, healthier, though the scar on his forehead was still visible. She wanted to scream the truth. She wanted to tell him that she was the one who had held him when he thought he was dying. But then she thought of Jessica, the hero on the magazine covers. Who would believe a janitor over a billionaire's fiancé and a hospital director? "No," Sir Lowe whispered, looking down. "I'm just the cleaning lady." "That song?" Stephen pressed, ignoring her apology. My mother used to sing it, Laura said, picking up her bucket. Stephen watched her walk away, a strange magnetic pull tugging at his chest. He pulled out his phone and dialed his private investigator. I need you to look into someone, he said, watching Laura disappear around the corner. A janitor in my building. Back at the penthouse, Jessica was panicking. She had just taken a pregnancy test. It was positive, and she knew with terrifying certainty that the baby wasn't Stephen's. It belonged to Gary Allen, the bartender she had been seeing on the side, the only man who knew the truths about that night because he had been in the car with her miles away from where Stephen crashed. She called her mother Deborah. Mom, we have a problem, Jessica whispered. Deborah's voice was ice cold over the line. There are no problems, Jessica. Only situations to be managed. If you're pregnant, it's Stephen's. We make it Stephen's. And if anyone gets in the way... The dossier on Stephen's mahogany desk was thin, but its contents weighed heavily on the room's atmosphere. The private investigator had been thorough. Stephen flipped through the candid photographs. Laura Perez hauling hoses at the Oak Creek fire station. Laura laughing with a group of rough-looking men in turnout gear. Laura sitting on the steps of a rusted trailer, wrapping a bandage around her younger brother's ankle. There was no record of criminal activity, no deceit, only a stark, brutal history of survival. But the detail that made Stephen S. breathage was a single line in her medical history obtained through gray market channels, blood type, O negative, the universal donor, the same blood type that flowed through his veins, now the blood that had saved him. He looked at the photo of Laura again. Why would a woman who saved his life endure the humiliation of scrubbing his floors without saying a word? And why did Jessica, who claimed to be his savior, wince at the sight of a paper cut? Stephen decided to test the waters, but he had to be careful. The next evening, a thunderstorm battered the glass walls of the Thomas Dynamics Tower. The sound of the wind howling was too similar to the night of the accident. Stephen was alone in his office, or so he thought. As the lightning flashed, illuminating the room in a strobe of stark white, the memories assaulted him: the screech of tires, the crushing metal, the smell of burning gasoline. His chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. The room spun. He gripped the edge of his desk, gasping for air, drowning in a phantom flood. He was back in the ravine. The door creaked open. It was Laura, pushing her cleaning cart. She saw him immediately, the poly skin, the trembling hands, the 1,000-yard stare. She didn't scream or run for help. Her training kicked in. She abandoned the cart and crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside his chair. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice firm and grounding, cutting through the panic. Stephen turned his eyes toward her, wild with fear. "You're safe," she commanded, placing a warm, rough hand on his cold one. "The crash is over. You're in your office. The floor is solid, filled the desk." She guided his breathing, matching her inhale to his, slowing the rhythm down. It was intimate, raw, and undeniable. As his heart rate slowed, Stephen looked at her. The smell of rain on her uniform, the amber eyes filled with a fierce, protective resolve, it was the same presence. He knew it in his bones. "It was you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "In the ravine." Laura pulled back, fear flickering in her eyes. She thought of her job, her brother's tuition, and the powerful forces Deborah and Jessica that could crush her if she spoke out. "I just know." "First aid, sir," she lied, standing up and retreating to the safety of her lowly status. "I'm a volunteer firefighter." She grabbed her cleaning supplies and fled the room before he could ask more, leaving Stephen with a certainty that terrified him. He wasn't crazy, he was being played. Meanwhile, Jessica's facade was cracking. The pregnancy test had turned her world upside down. She met Gary, the father of the child, in a dive bar on the outskirts of the city. Gary was a good man, a mechanic with grease under his fingernails and a heart of gold, but he had no money. "We can make this work, Jessica," Gary pleaded, holding her hand. "I love you." Jessica snatched her hand away, her face twisting in disgust. "Figure it out. In a trailer." "No, Gary. I have a winning lottery ticket waiting for me in the penthouse." She broke Gary's heart right there in the booth, leaving him with the check and a threat to never contact her again. She drove straight to her mother's office. Deborah listened to Jessica's plan with a cold, calculating nod. "It's risky," Deborah said, drumming her fingers on the desk, "but it will lock him down. Stephen is a man of honor. If he thinks he got you pregnant, he'll marry you immediately to legitimize the child." Deborah pulled up the security feed from Stephen's office. She had been monitoring the cameras. She saw the moment between Stephen and Laura. She saw the way Stephen looked at the janitor. "That cleaning girl?" Deborah hissed. "She's getting too close. She's like a weed. You pull her out, and she grows back in the cracks." The next morning, Jessica staged a grand performance. She fainted during breakfast. When she came to, she tearfully confessed to Stephen that she was pregnant. Stephen felt the walls closing in. He should have been overjoyed. He had always wanted a family. But the thought of binding himself to Jessica forever, especially now that he suspected she was a fraud, made him feel sick. Yet his sense of duty was his tragic flaw. "We'll get married," he said, his voice void of emotion. Jessica threw her arms around him, hiding her triumphant smirk in his shoulder. Laura heard the news through the office grapevine. It felt like a physical blow. She told herself she had no right to be jealous, but her heart betrayed her. She tried to resign, handing her letter to the facility's manager, but Stephen intercepted it. He called her to his office. He asked, his tone desperate, "Is it?" Laura stood tall, her pride the only thing she had left. "Mr. Thomas, I have to move on. This job? I have a proposition," Stephen said, ignoring her resignation. "My grandmother, Virginia Wright, lives on the estate. She had a stroke last week. She hates the AGSC nurses. She needs someone strong, someone with medical training, but who isn't. Clinical, someone kind. I want you to take care of her live-in position." It was a lifeline Laura couldn't refuse, and it was Stephen's desperate attempt to keep the only real thing in his life close to him. Against her better judgment, she accepted. Living at the Thomas estate brought Laura into the lion's den. Virginia was a sharp-tongued matriarch who saw through everyone's nonsense, but she was trapped in a failing body. Laura treated her with dignity, listening to her stories, lifting her with gentle strength, and singing the lullabies Virginia loved. Virginia grew to adore Laura, and in turn, Laura found a grandmother she never had. Stephen would visit every evening, ostensibly to see Virginia, but really to watch Laura. They would sit by the fire, talking about books, philosophy, and life. The connection deepened, a slow-burning fire that threatened to consume the lies surrounding them. One afternoon, while Laura was helping Virginia in the garden, Jessica arrived. She saw the way Stephen watched Laura from the balcony. The jealousy was instantaneous and toxic. Jessica marched to her mother, who was visiting. "He's in love with the help, Mom," Jessica shrieked in the guest room. "He looks at her like she's the one who saved him. If she stays, he'll figure it out. He'll do a DNA test." Deborah narrowed her eyes. "Then we don't just fire her. We destroy her character." The plan was set in motion the night of the engagement party. The estate was filled with the city's elite. Laura was in the kitchen, helping the staff, staying out of sight. Deborah slipped into Virginia's bedroom. She opened the safe. She knew the combination. Having manipulated Virginia's finances for year's end, took a diamond brooch, a family heirloom worth $500,000. She wrapped it in a handkerchief and went down to the servants' quarters. She found Laura's bag and tucked the brooch deep inside a side pocket. Later that night, as the party roared on, Deborah frantically approached Stephen. "Stephen, it's terrible. Virginia's diamond brooch is missing." The music stopped. Security was called. "Search everyone," Deborah commanded, playing the role of the concerned administrator perfectly. Stephen watched, his fussy Polly, as the security team lined up the staff. He caught Laura's eye. She looked confused, but not guilty. "This is ridiculous," Stephen muttered. "We'll see," Jessica said, clutching his arm, her nails digging into his suit jacket. The security guard dumped the contents of Laura's worn canvas bag onto the table. Out fell her spare uniform, a book, an apple, and the diamond brooch, glittering accusingly under the chandelier's light. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Laura stared at the jewelry, the color draining from her face. I didn't put that there," she stammered, looking at Stephen. "Stephen, please. You know me?" Stephen felt like the ground had opened up beneath him again. The evidence was right there. Deborah stepped forward, her voice dripping with disappointed venom. "It's always the ones you trust the most, isn't it? A poor girl, desperate for money. Call the police," Jessica demanded. "No," Stephen said, his voice low. He looked at Laura, conflict raging in his eyes. He wanted to believe her, but the betrayal felt so visceral. If she could lie about this, could she have lied about the connection he felt? Was he just a mark to her? To no police? Laura cried, tears finally spilling over. Stefan roared, the pain of the perceived betrayal turning into fury. Leave the estate. Laura grabbed her empty bag, leaving the brooch on the table. She ran out of the mansion into the pouring rain, the same rain that had started this whole tragedy. As she ran down the long driveway, heartbroken and humiliated, she didn't see the dark sedan parked near the gate. He watched Laura walk into the darkness, revving his engine. Back in the mansion, Virginia, who had been wheeled out during the commotion, stared at Deborah with eyes that were suddenly very clear. She couldn't speak well, but she knew. She pointed a shaking finger at Deborah, trying to form words, but Deborah quickly stepped in, grabbing the wheelchair handles. "Oh, poor Virginia. She's agitated. Do you think Stephen was right to trust the evidence? Or should he have trusted his gut instinct about Laura? Let me know your thoughts." The days following Laura's expulsion from the Thomas estate were a blur of gray skies and silent despair. Laura returned to the cramped trailer in Oak Creek, the smell of damp insulation and stale air greeting her like an old, unwanted friend. She didn't fight the injustice. She was too exhausted. She simply went back to the fire station, picking up shifts, throwing herself into the physical exhaustion of the job to drown out the memory of Stephen S. eyes filled with betrayal. Every time the alarm bell rang, she hoped it would be a call that would take her far away, or perhaps one dangerous enough to make her forget everything else. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was suffocating. Stephen was preparing for the wedding, but he felt like a man walking to the gallows. The house was quiet without Laura's humming, without the warmth she brought to the cold marble halls. Virginia had stopped eating. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, refusing to look at Jessica or Deborah. Stephen sat by his grandmother's bedside one rainy evening, holding her frail hand. "I'm sorry, Nana," he whispered. "I know you liked her." Virginia's grip suddenly tightened, her knuckles white. With a gargantuan effort, she pointed a shaking finger toward the velvet armchair in the corner, the one Deborah had sat in the night of the party. She tried to speak, a guttural sound forming in her throat. "Check." Stephen frowned, confused. He walked to the chair. He felt around the cushions. Deeply tucked into the side lining, he found a crumpled receipt. It was a pawn shop slip, dated 3 years ago, for a diamond necklace. It was signed by Deborah Harris. Stephen stared at it. It proved Deborah had money troubles, but it didn't prove Laura's innocence. However, it planted a seed of doubt. If Deborah was desperate enough to pawn jewelry years ago, was she capable of framing someone now to secure a billion-dollar fortune for her daughter? Stephen's suspicion grew into an obsession. The next morning, instead of going to his office, he drove to the city hospital, not the administrative wing, where Deborah ruled, but the records department in the basement. He used his authority as a major donor to demand the full, unredacted logs from the night of his accident. The clerk, intimidated by his presence, handed over the files. Stephen scanned the pages, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found the transfusion log. Patient Stephen Thomas, blood type O negative, donor ID, anonymous employee number 492. He frowned. Jessica wasn't an employee? He scrolled further down to the employee cross-reference list. Hosh 492. Laura Perez, R. Support. The world stopped spinning. The air left the room. It wasn't Jessica. It had never been Jessica. Jessica's medical file, which he pulled next, showed she was a positive blood that would have killed him if transfused. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Laura had saved him. Laura had given her blood, her strength, and her care, and in return, he had humiliated her and cast her out.